The courthouse was never meant to be a place of warmth. Its marble floors echoed with cold footsteps. Its walls carried the weight of decades of disputes, and its heavy wooden doors often seemed to shut out the world of laughter and play that lived just beyond the square. Inside, the morning light struggled to soften the air of formality. It streamed through tall windows, catching in the dust motes that danced like tiny flecks of gold before disappearing into the stillness. Most mornings in this courthouse unfolded the same way: attorneys flipping through thick files, jurors shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and the judge entering with an expression that reminded everyone that justice carried no room for levity. But on this morning, something different hung in the air, something unexpected. It wasn't just the people waiting for the case to begin that made the difference. It was the quiet presence of a four-legged witness. Near the front of the room, by the witness stand where countless voices had trembled before, sat a dog. Not just any dog, but a highly trained canine officer, his glossy black and tan coat gleaming under the soft lights. His vest bore the seal of the county sheriff's department, yet his posture was calm, almost gentle. Unlike the stern faces of the bailiffs or the rigid posture of the attorneys, the dog sat with an ease that suggested patience. His eyes, deep and steady, scanned the room not with judgment, but with quiet watchfulness. Whispers moved through the benches at the sight. "Is that a police dog?" one juror murmured under their breath. Another leaned slightly forward, lips pressed tight, trying not to stare. Many of them had seen canine officers in action on the Yavalion streets during tense arrests or on news footage of drug busts, but few had ever seen one stationed inside a courtroom, resting obediently by the witness stand. It was unusual, almost disarming, and it made people wonder just what kind of testimony they were about to hear. For Judge Emily Warren, seated high above the room with her black robe draped carefully around her shoulders, the scene was also unusual. In her 2 decades of service, she had presided over every kind of case imaginable: burglary, fraud, custody battles, even violent crimes, but never had she started a hearing with a canine officer in attendance. She tapped her pen lightly against her notepad, her keen eyes flicking between the attorneys and the dog. Though she knew why the canine was there, she couldn't help but reflect on how rare it was to allow such a presence in her courtroom. Still, the circumstances of the day justified it. At the prosecution's table, Assistant District Attorney Rachel Miller sat with her case files neatly stacked, her posture betraying both professionalism and a hint of nerves. She had fought hard for the dog's presence. To her, the case was about more than statutes and evidence. It was about protecting a voice so small, so fragile, that without help, it might never be heard. And that voice belonged to the toddler expected to take the stand. Across the aisle, defense attorney James Clark leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. He had opposed the request to bring a comfort animal into the courtroom, arguing it could bias the jury by playing on emotions rather than facts. Yet the judge had ruled otherwise, citing the importance of ensuring that even the youngest and most vulnerable witnesses had the chance to speak freely. Clark folded his arms now, determined to focus on legal strategy rather than sentiment. But even he couldn't deny the strangeness of the sight before him. The courtroom was unusually full for a midweek morning. Families of both sides sat clustered together, their faces marked with tension. Reporters, tipped off about the unusual nature of the case, had slipped quietly into the back rows, their notepads ready. Local journalists knew this was no ordinary proceeding. The involvement of a child so young guaranteed public interest. Still, none of them could yet grasp the way this story would spread far beyond the county courthouse and touch hearts across the nation. At precisely 9 a.m., the bailiff's voice boomed across the chamber. "All rise." Chairs scraped. The floor, papers rustled, and the collective sound of people standing filled the air. Judge Warren entered, her gavel in hand, and gave a brief nod before motioning for everyone to sit. The proceedings began in the standard way roll call, procedural reminders, and a review of motions. But throughout the formalities, eyes kept flicking toward the K9. The dog remained unmoved by the attention. His breathing was slow, steady, his ears occasionally twitching at the sound of footsteps. His handler, seated just a few feet away, kept a loose grip on the leash, confident in the animal's discipline. Unlike most human witnesses, the dog seemed immune to nerves. Instead, his steady presence filled the space with an odd kind of reassurance, though no one yet realized how vital that reassurance would be. As the preliminaries concluded, the mood shifted. Everyone knew what was coming next. The youngest witness the county had ever seen would soon be brought into the courtroom. Anticipation thickened the air, and even the most seasoned attendees felt a knot of tension tighten in their chests. The attorneys shuffled their notes, the judge adjusted her glasses, and the jurors leaned forward ever so slightly. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, the double doors at the side of the courtroom creaked open. All heads turned as a small figure appeared in the doorway, dwarfed by the bailiff who walked beside them. The child's tiny shoes tapped softly against the marble floor, each step echoing louder than it should have in the hushed space. Clutched tightly in one hand was a warm teddy bear, its fur faded from years of love. In the other hand, the child held nothing, fingers curling and uncurling nervously. The toddler, no more than 3 years old, blinked against the brightness of the room. Their wide eyes scanned the rows of unfamiliar faces, the looming furniture, the high bench where the judge sat watching. The room itself seemed enormous compared to their tiny frame. For an instant, it looked as though the child might retreat, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the setting. But then, something remarkable happened. The child's gaze fell not on the judge, not on the attorneys, not even on the rows of strangers. It landed squarely on the K9, seated patiently by the witness stand. The dog, sensing the attention, lifted his head and wagged his tail once. The child paused, then took a tentative step forward. The bailiff slowed, allowing the toddler to approach at their own pace. And just like that, the fear that had gripped the room seemed to ease, replaced by the fragile beginnings of trust. The moment did not go unnoticed. A murmur rippled quietly among the observers, though it was quickly hushed by a glance from the bailiff. The judge leaned slightly forward, her lips pressed in a thoughtful line. Rachel Miller, at the prosecution's table, felt her chest tighten with hope. She had believed in the power of the K9 program, but seeing it work in real time was something else entirely. Even defense attorney Clark, skeptical as ever, shifted in his seat with an expression that betrayed curiosity. As the toddler climbed carefully into the oversized wooden chair at the witness stand, the K9 remained close, his body angled toward the child as if offering silent support. The handler gave a subtle nod, confirming that the dog would stay still unless called upon. All eyes remained fixed on the unlikely pair, the smallest witness in the county's history, and the loyal animal that had already given them courage to enter the room. In that moment, before a single word of testimony had been spoken, the atmosphere of the courtroom had changed. It was no longer defined by cold marble, rigid rules, or stern traditions. It was defined by the unspoken bond between a child and a dog, a bond strong enough to command the attention of everyone present. The trial had begun, but what the people in that room would remember most was not the legal arguments or the evidence presented. It was the unusual witness who sat quietly by the stand, tail resting against the floor, waiting to help a child find their voice. And as Judge Warren raised her gavel to continue, she could not help but think that justice on this day might look different than ever before. The child sat perched awkwardly on the oversized wooden chair, legs dangling in the air, unable to reach the floor. From the gallery, it looked as though the chair had swallowed them whole, leaving only a small body clutching a worn teddy bear, its fur rubbed thin from countless nights of comfort. The bear's stitched smile seemed out of place in the courtroom's solemn air, but for the toddler, it was a shield, one they refused to release, even as the clerk approached with a stack of official papers. The clerk bent slightly, her voice gentle but still formal. "Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" she asked, her words simplified for such a young mind. The child blinked up at her, then down at the teddy bear, then back again. After a long pause, they nodded, whispering a single word, "Yes." That one syllable, fragile yet audible, sent a ripple of emotion through the room. It was not the certainty of an adult swearing an oath, but the bravery of a child agreeing to step into a world too large for them. Judge Warren leaned forward slightly, softening her usual sternness. "You're very brave," she said, her tone lighter than it had been all morning. The child glanced at her, unsure, before returning their gaze to the canine seated by the stand. The dog, sensing the weight of the moment, shifted just enough to lay its chin on its paws, an image of patience. The attorneys exchanged glances. Rachel Miller's lips pressed together as if holding back a sigh of relief. James Clark, the defense attorney, tapped his pen against his notepad, his skepticism visibly wavering. The jurors, meanwhile, leaned forward unconsciously, their faces softening in the presence of such innocence. The toddler's eyes swept nervously across the room. The rows of strangers blurred together into something overwhelming, a wall of faces watching, judging, expecting. The little fingers clutched the teddy tighter, knuckles whitening. For a moment, silence hung heavy, and it seemed as though fear might win. But then, from the corner of their vision, the child saw the dog's tail twitch. Just a small movement, but enough to break through the storm of nerves. The toddler exhaled shakily, shifting closer to the edge of the chair though the proximity to the canine gave them strength. The prosecutor took a step forward, careful not to loom too close. "Do you know why you're here today?" she asked softly. The child hesitated, eyes darting again to the dog. Instead of answering the woman, they whispered to the canine, voice trembling but sincere, "I'm brave, right?" The dog, of course, could not answer, but his quiet stillness seemed to say everything. The toddler nodded to themselves, as though reassured by the dog's presence. Then, louder this time, they said, "I'm brave." The courtroom shifted. Even the defense attorney, who had built a career on skepticism, felt a crack in his usual armor. Courage, it seemed, was not always loud. Sometimes it came in whispers from the smallest mouths. Judge Warren lowered her gaze briefly, blinking faster than usual. She had presided over hardened criminals and tragic testimonies, but never had she been struck so deeply by such unfiltered innocence. The child's teddy bear slipped slightly from their grasp and landed with a soft thump on the floor. The sound echoed louder than expected, and for an instant the toddler froze, wide-eyed. But before the bailiff could step forward, the canine shifted, nudging the toy gently with his nose until it slid back toward the child's chair. The toddler's face broke into the faintest smile. A laugh, small but real, bubbled out and bounced across the hushed courtroom. It was a sound no one had expected, a laugh in the middle of a trial. Yet it did not feel out of place. It felt necessary. The prosecutor waited, giving the child space to settle. Then, with careful pacing, she asked, "Do you feel safe here?" This time, the toddler did not hesitate. Their tiny hand reached down, brushing the canine's fur. "Safe with him," they whispered, pointing toward the dog. "He makes the scary go away." The words were not rehearsed. They were not legal, but they were honest, and they hung in the air like a declaration far more powerful than any oath. Gasps, quiet but audible, rippled through the gallery. One juror dabbed at her eye with a tissue. Even the court reporter, who had spent years typing without expression, paused briefly before resuming. The child's courage was not measured in volume or detail. It was measured in their ability to sit in that massive chair, surrounded by strangers, and still find a way to speak. It was in the way their small voice, trembling and uneven, carried more truth than entire case files filled with statements. Rachel Miller felt her throat tighten. She knew the testimony itself would come later, with carefully worded questions and answers. But what mattered most was already happening. The child was speaking. The child was seen. Judge Warren placed her pen gently on the desk, folding her hands together. "You are very, very brave," she said, her voice carrying the kind of softness rarely heard in her courtroom. "And we are all listening." The toddler glanced up at her, then down again at the K9, as though deciding where to place there. Trust. The decision was clear. The dog received the child's focus once more, his steady presence continuing to shield them from the enormity of the room. For the jurors, the scene was unforgettable. They had been prepared for long hours of legal jargon, dry testimonies, and carefully constructed arguments. What they witnessed instead was raw humanity, a reminder that justice was not abstract, but deeply personal. It was about children who clutched teddy bears and whispered for reassurance. It was about dogs who offered comfort without words. And for that one fragile morning, the weight of law and procedure gave way to something else entirely. The quiet courage of a toddler who dared to speak. The courtroom had grown so quiet that the sound of the clock ticking above the double doors felt like thunder. Jurors shifted in their seats, not from boredom, but from the heavy anticipation of what might come next. Everyone in the room, from a judge to the attorneys, knew that this was the moment that could make or break the day. The child, still perched on the witness stand, sat with wide eyes and trembling hands. The oversized chair dwarfed their tiny body, making them look more like a doll placed among giants than a witness in a court of law. The teddy bear rested safely against their lap, while the K9 officer lay patiently on the floor, his head tilted slightly upward as though waiting for his role to begin. For a long stretch of seconds, no one spoke. The judge allowed silence to hang, resisting the urge to fill it with reassurance. The attorneys held back their questions, careful not to overwhelm the toddler with too much pressure. Even the jurors seemed to hold their breath. And then it happened. The toddler turned their head, not toward the judge or the prosecutor, but toward the K9 at their side. Their lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. They swallowed, took a shaky breath, and leaned slightly forward, their tiny fingers brushing across the edge of the witness stand. Finally, in a voice so soft that people at the back leaned forward to catch it, the child whispered, "You're my brave dog." The words were not rehearsed. They were not prompted. They were not even directed at the people who mattered most in terms of procedure. But those 5 words carried more power than any legal argument presented that day. The K9, sensing the fragile sound, lifted his head and wagged his tail once, the movement deliberate and steady. His dark eyes met the child's, and though he could not speak, the exchange was undeniable. The toddler's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. Their shoulders, which had been hunched tight with tension, loosened just a little. Gasps rippled through the room. They were not loud, but they were there. A soft wave of emotion that passed from one row of benches to the next. A juror pressed a hand to her chest. A reporter scribbled furiously into her notebook, her pen nearly tearing the paper. Even the bailiff, usually stoic, let out a slow exhale as though releasing air he hadn't realized he was holding. Judge. Warren's face softened, her usual composure slipping into something unmistakably human. Her eyes glistened, though she quickly blinked the moisture away. She had heard thousands of testimonies in her career, but never one that began like this. Not with facts, not with dates, but with trust. The prosecutor, Rachel Miller, felt her own throat tighten. She had fought to bring the K-9 into the courtroom precisely for this reason. She knew the child needed more than lawyers and procedure. They needed an anchor. And in that moment, the anchor had done exactly what it was meant to. On the other side of the aisle, James Clark, the defense attorney, shifted in his seat. He tapped his pen against his notepad, but this time there was no smirk on his lips. His expression was unreadable, caught somewhere between discomfort and reluctant admiration. Even he could not deny the undeniable power of that small voice. The child reached down, their tiny fingers brushing through the K-9's fur. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch, but allowed the touch as though he had been waiting for it all along. The child's breathing slowed, the trembling in their hands easing just enough to steady the teddy bear once more. "You're my brave dog," the child repeated, a little louder this time. Their eyes flicked briefly toward the rows of strangers, before darting back to the K-9. The second declaration was not just for the dog, it was for themselves. A reminder that courage could be spoken into existence. The moment was not lost. On the jurors, they exchanged looks, some with tears shining in their eyes, others with expressions of awe. They had been prepared for cold evidence, for black and white arguments. Instead, they were witnessing something far more profound, the raw humanity at the heart of justice. The judge finally spoke, her voice softer than it had been all morning. "That's a wonderful friend you have there," she said, gesturing gently toward the K-9. "And I think he's very lucky to have you too." The child blinked, as if surprised that the judge had acknowledged the bond. Then, for the first time since entering the courtroom, a genuine smile spread across their face. It was small, fleeting, but it was real. In that instant, the sterile courtroom transformed. It was no longer just a place of law and order, of rules and punishments. It became, for a brief time, a sanctuary of trust. Trust between a child and a dog. Trust between vulnerability and strength. The prosecutor took a slow breath, choosing her words carefully. "Can you tell us?" she asked gently. "How he makes you feel safe?" The toddler looked down at the K-9, still stroking his fur. "Because he stays," they whispered. "He doesn't go away when it's scary." The words struck deeper than any prepared testimony could have. Simple, honest, unquestionably true. And everyone in that room, attorneys, jurors, reporters, even the judge, felt it. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer tense, no longer heavy with expectation. It was reverent, as though the courtroom itself was holding its breath in respect for what had just been spoken. The child, unaware of the ripple they had caused, leaned forward again, resting their head against the edge of the witness stand. Their tiny hand never left the K-9's fur. For them, the courtroom was still a scary place filled with too many eyes, but it no longer felt unbearable. They were not alone. As the proceedings continued, everyone knew they had already witnessed the heart of the case, not in evidence or cross-examinations, but in the soft declaration of a toddler who found courage in the presence of a loyal dog. And though the trial was far from over, one truth had already been written in the hearts of all who were there. Sometimes the bravest words are whispered not to people, but to the quiet companions who never leave our side. The air in the courtroom was different now. The heavy stillness of anticipation had given way to something gentler, almost fragile, as if everyone present was afraid that even a single cough might break the spell. The child had spoken. It was Not the testimony the attorneys had prepared for, not the kind of evidence one could record neatly into transcripts and exhibits, but it was something far more powerful. "You're my brave dog." Those words still hung in the air, like a song replaying itself in every ear. They had begun as a whisper, shaky and uncertain, but they had bloomed into a declaration, not for the judge, not for the jury, but for the only companion who seemed to exist in the child's world, the canine resting by their side. The dog, unbothered by the magnitude of the moment, remained steady, his eyes fixed on the small human who leaned closer with each passing second. For years, he had been trained for discipline, for duty, for strength in the face of chaos. Yet no training manual could have prepared him for this. Still, he seemed to know exactly what to do. Simply stay, simply be. The toddler's hand moved again, tentative at first, then firmer, stroking the dog's fur as if reassuring themselves that he was real. The touch grounded them, anchoring them against the enormity of the courtroom. And then, with the same soft honesty that had silenced the room, the child began to speak again. "He makes the scary go away," they murmured, still speaking more. To the K9 than to the adults. "When I'm with him, it doesn't hurt in here." They pressed their tiny hand against their chest, over their heart. The prosecutor, Rachel Miller, felt a chill run through her. She had carefully rehearsed a line of questions designed to guide the child toward clear answers, but she did not dare interrupt now. This was not testimony in the legal sense. It was testimony in the truest, rawest sense. The words carried. No agenda, no adult interpretations. They were pure. Judge Warren leaned forward, her face softened into an expression almost maternal. She had spent her career keeping a wall between her emotions and her duties, but that wall now felt thinner than ever. She knew better than anyone that the child's words might not fit neatly into the confines of court record, yet she also knew that these words mattered. Perhaps more than anything else that would be said that day. Across the aisle, James Clark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had built his reputation on precision, on facts that left no room for sentiment. But as he watched the toddler confide in the dog, he felt something crack within him. A memory of his own daughter at that age, clutching a stuffed rabbit at night, whispering secrets only the toy was meant to hear. For the first time, he wondered whether his arguments would stand against something this honest, this human. The jurors leaned forward, as though the child's words were pulling them closer. A few blinked away tears. Others smiled faintly, their hearts aching with a mixture of sorrow and admiration. They had been prepared to weigh evidence, but not to witness something so intimate unfold before them. The child continued, still stroking the canine's fur, their voice gaining steadiness with each sentence. "He doesn't leave. Not when it's loud, not when it's scary. He just stays. And I know he won't let the bad come close." The dog gave a low, quiet huff. Not a bark, not a whine, just a sound of acknowledgement. The child's smile widened slightly. "See?" they said, pointing at him with tiny fingers. "He understands." And in that instant, it no longer felt like a courtroom. It felt like a safe place, a place where a child's truth could be spoken without fear of being dismissed. The marble walls, the wooden benches, the gavel, all of it faded into the background, overshadowed by the bond revealed between child and dog. The court reporter, who had typed thousands of words over her long career, paused briefly as her fingers hovered above the keys. She glanced up, her professional detachment faltering. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that she wasn't just recording a trial. She was recording a story that would be told long after the case was forgotten. Rachel Miller finally found her voice, careful not to disturb the fragile courage unfolding before her. "You feel safe when he's near?" she asked gently. The toddler nodded. "He makes me strong." Then, Almost as if testing their own words, they added, "Brave, too." The prosecutor's chest tightened. That single statement, small and unpolished, carried more weight than entire witness testimonies she had worked with in the past. It wasn't the kind of evidence she could point to in a closing argument, but she knew it was the kind the jurors carried in their hearts when they deliberated. The judge lowered her gavel slightly, as though unwilling to let anything break the rhythm of the moment. Her eyes shimmered again, betraying the tears she had tried to suppress. She had seen hardened men break down in her courtroom, seen victims sob under the weight of retelling their pain. But never had she seen a child of 3 speak with such simple clarity, armed with nothing more than trust in a loyal companion. The canine shifted slightly, leaning closer to the child until their tiny hand rested against his shoulder. The child leaned in, pressing their cheek against his fur. "You're my best friend," they whispered, so quietly that only those closest could hear. And that was when it became clear. The canine was more than just a comfort tool, more than a bridge to testimony. He was, for this child, a lifeline. Rachel Miller swallowed hard, resisting the urge to let her own emotions spill into her voice. She had fought cases before where facts alone had been enough to sway juries. But this was different. This wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about ensuring that the smallest voices were heard, even when they trembled. For James Clark, the defense attorney, the moment was unnerving. He prided himself on dismantling testimony, on pointing out inconsistencies, on reminding juries of the fallibility of memory. But what could he do here? What counter-argument could dismantle the sight of a child resting their head on a dog's shoulder, whispering about bravery? No cross-examination could erase that image from the minds of the jury. He scribbled a note on his pad, but the ink blurred slightly under the moisture gathering in his eyes. The jurors, now deeply invested, exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. They weren't just listening. They were feeling. And that, in any courtroom, was more powerful than any piece of paper or exhibit. The judge finally broke the silence with a voice that was softer than usual. "You are very brave," she said again, repeating the phrase as though willing it into the child's heart. "And you're teaching all of us something today." The child looked up at her for a brief moment, their eyes wide with innocence. Then, almost shyly, they buried their face into the canine's fur once more. And in that moment, it became undeniable. The bond between them wasn't just comfort. It was strength. It was trust. It was the reason the child could sit in a chair, far too big, in a room far too overwhelming, and still find the courage to speak. The courtroom, once a place of rigid law, had become a place of compassion. And for everyone present, it was clear this was no longer just a trial. It was a story of how trust could be born in silence, revealed in whispers, and held steady by the quiet presence of a faithful friend. For most of her career, Judge Emily Warren had been known as a pillar of composure. Lawyers often remarked that she was unshakable, a woman who could listen to hours of testimony about violence, betrayal, or grief without letting so much as a flicker cross her face. She prided herself on that steadiness. It was her armor, her way of protecting both herself and the sanctity of the bench. But today, her armor was cracking. She sat higher than anyone else in the room, elevated both physically and symbolically above the proceedings, yet she felt more exposed than she ever had before. In front of her, a toddler sat in the oversized witness chair, head nestled against the shoulder of a canine officer who remained perfectly still. The child's words, whispered, fragile, yet unflinchingly sincere, seemed to reverberate through every corner of the courtroom. "You're my brave dog." Simple words, 5 syllables. Yet they carried a weight Judge Warren had anticipated. They were not addressed to her, not even to the jury whose verdict would matter in the end. They were addressed to a creature who didn't understand laws or statutes, but who embodied something more elemental, trust. She blinked, her vision momentarily blurred by moisture she hadn't felt coming. Quickly, she lowered her eyes, pretending to scan the notes on her desk. But the words echoed in her mind, each repetition unraveling a little more of the professional distance she had built over the years. Her fingers tightened slightly around her gavel. She had held that gavel through countless trials, pounding it down to restore order, to silence heated voices, to assert control. But in this moment, she felt no impulse to use it. The courtroom was already silent, not out of fear or authority, but out of reverence for the small voice that had spoken. She glanced toward the jury box. Their faces told her everything. Some were misty-eyed, others visibly swallowing back emotion. These were not reactions she could dismiss. A jury moved by sympathy was always dangerous ground in a legal proceeding, yet she could not bring herself to admonish them. She felt it too. Her gaze shifted back to the child. They were stroking the canine's fur with tiny, deliberate motions, each stroke slower, calmer than the last. The dog's eyes remained fixed on the child, patient and knowing. Judge Warren felt her chest tighten at the sight. She had seen hardened criminals weep on the stand, seen victims tremble as they recounted unspeakable horrors. But never had she seen a child so young reveal such vulnerability and such courage, all in the same breath. She remembered her own daughter at that age, years ago, sitting at the kitchen table with pigtails bouncing as she explained in earnest detail why her stuffed bunny was the bravest companion in the world. That memory, buried under layers of rulings and legal codes, surfaced unbidden now. It struck her with such force that she had to inhale slowly to steady herself. The prosecutor, Rachel Miller, glanced up at her with eyes full of unspoken gratitude. The defense attorney, James Clark, shifted uncomfortably, clearly grappling with his own emotions. But neither of them mattered in this instant. For Judge Warren, the only thing that mattered was the child in the chair, speaking not to adults who demanded answers, but to a dog who asked nothing in return. Her robe, heavy on her shoulders, suddenly felt less like a symbol of authority and more like a barrier, one she wished she could shed for just a moment to kneel beside that child and tell them what she so desperately wanted to say. You're safe. You're stronger than you know. And your words matter more than you think. Instead, bound by her role, she leaned slightly forward and let her voice soften. You are very brave, she said. The words carried across the courtroom, steady yet laced with emotion. Braver than most people who sit in that chair. The child looked up at her, eyes wide, then quickly back down at the canine, as though unsure how to accept the compliment. But their lips curved into a tiny, fleeting smile. And for Judge Warren, that smile was enough to push her composure to its limits. She glanced briefly at the stenographer, who was dutifully typing every word. It struck her suddenly. Decades from now, someone might read these transcripts, perhaps long after the case itself was forgotten. And when they reached this section, they would see the record of a toddler's first words on the stand. They would see her response, carefully chosen, restrained yet sincere. But what they would not see, could never see, was the wave of emotion that had swept through the room, binding strangers together in a shared moment of humanity. Her throat tightened again, and she quickly looked down at her notes to mask it. She tapped her pen against the margin, trying to anchor herself in the mundane details of the case. But the words blurred, meaningless against the echo of the child's voice. Across the room, the jurors were no longer thinking of legal definitions or burdens of proof. They were thinking of their own children, their nieces, their grandchildren. They were thinking of innocence and how fragile it was and how desperately it needed protection. Judge Warren knew it was her duty to keep them focused on the facts, to remind them later during deliberations that verdicts must be based on evidence, not emotion. But in this moment, she did not intervene. She let them feel it. Because she felt it too. The child shifted in the chair, adjusting the teddy bear in their lap, and whispered something too soft for the recorders to catch. "You stay with me." It was unclear whether they were speaking to the dog or to themselves, but either way, the canine responded by pressing his chin against the child's leg. The sight pierced straight through Judge Warren's practiced composure. Her vision blurred. Again, and this time she did not fight it. She allowed the tears to gather, though she blinked them back before they could fall. She was not here to weep. She was here to lead. Yet she understood in that instant that leadership sometimes meant allowing humanity to show. She thought of the oath she had taken so many years ago, to uphold justice, to protect the vulnerable, to ensure fairness for all. She had recited those words countless times, reminding herself of them during sleepless nights after difficult rulings. But today she realized those words were no longer abstract. They were embodied in the trembling voice of a toddler who had dared to speak in a place designed for adults. And so, when she spoke again, her voice carried not just the authority of the bench, but the sincerity of a woman deeply moved. "We are all very proud of you," she said. "And I want you to remember, what you're doing right now is something even grown-ups sometimes cannot do." The child's eyes flicked up again, meeting hers for the briefest second. In that look, Judge Warren saw everything: fear, trust, fragility, and a spark of courage that could not be extinguished. It was a look she knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Around the room, people shifted, dabbing at eyes, clearing throats, pretending to adjust papers. The veneer of courtroom detachment had cracked, and through the cracks poured something raw and undeniable. For Judge Emily Warren, it was the moment she would later describe, not in transcripts, not in rulings, but in the quiet space of memory, as the day she remembered why she had chosen this path in the first place. Not for verdicts, not for titles, but for justice. And justice, she realized, was not always about punishment or law. Sometimes it was about listening to the smallest voices and allowing them to be heard. As she sat there, gavel resting quietly in her hand, she understood that the child's words had changed the course of the trial. But more than that, they had changed her. And though the proceedings would continue, though evidence would be presented, and arguments made, the memory of that moment, of tears threatening her vision, of a toddler whispering to a dog, of a courtroom united in shared humanity, would linger long after the case was closed. Compassion is a word often spoken in the abstract inside courtrooms, a quality hoped for in jurors, but rarely named outright. Trials are supposed to hinge on evidence, on facts lined up neatly, like puzzle pieces, until a clear picture emerges. Yet on this day, as the toddler sat curled against the K9, the air was thick not with legal reasoning, but with something far more human. The lesson began quietly. The jurors, 12 strangers pulled from everyday life, had arrived expecting. Long hours of procedure, their minds prepared for exhibits, testimony, and perhaps a bit of boredom. But as the child whispered into the dog's ear, their assumptions about justice shifted. One woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes with the corner of a sleeve, her thoughts drifting to her grandson, who still carried a blanket with fraying edges. A man 3 seats over swallowed hard, remembering how his daughter once hid under the covers during thunderstorms, convinced her stuffed lion was the only thing keeping monsters at bay. In those moments, the jury box was no longer filled with detached arbiters of law. It was filled with mothers, fathers, grandparents, neighbors, human beings moved by the simple honesty of a child's trust. The prosecutor, Rachel Miller, felt it too. She had gone to law school, believing in the power of reasoned arguments, and evidence that spoke louder than sentiment. But watching the toddler rest their head against the canine's steady shoulder, she realized that evidence was not always made of paper and ink. Sometimes it was etched into moments of truth that could never be replicated. She knew she could never script a moment like this, nor would she ever want to. Even the defense attorney, James Clark, found himself unsettled. Compassion was not a word he let into his practice. It softened arguments, muddled logic, swayed jurors for reasons that could not be quantified. Yet now, sitting at his table with his pen motionless in hand, he felt compassion rise like a tide inside him. He thought again of his own daughter, now grown, but once a little girl who whispered secrets to her stuffed rabbit. He wondered how he would feel if she had ever been in that witness chair, looking so small, so fragile, yet so determined. The thought hollowed him in a way he hadn't expected. Judge Warren, presiding from her bench, felt the lesson most acutely of all. She had spent years convincing herself that compassion and law should not intertwine too deeply, that her role demanded objectivity above all else. But now, as she looked down at the child and the dog, she understood that compassion was not the enemy of justice. It was its partner. For what was justice, if not the protection of the vulnerable? And how could one protect the vulnerable without first feeling the weight of their humanity? The lesson spread beyond the jury and the legal teams. In the gallery, spectators sat riveted. A reporter, usually quick to reduce cases to headlines and sound bites, found herself scribbling not legal jargon but emotions. Tiny voice, brave dog, courtroom transformed. She realized the story was not about a case anymore. It was about a moment in time where compassion had revealed itself in the unlikeliest of places. The child, oblivious to the ripples they had caused, continued to stroke the canine's fur, their tiny hand moving rhythmically as if each stroke gave them courage to breathe. They did not know that their whispered words had cracked open the hearts of strangers. They only knew that their brave dog stayed by their side, and that, for now, was enough. When the prosecutor asked her next question, she spoke with more gentleness than she had ever used in court before. "Can you tell us what makes you feel safe when he's with you?" The child's eyes flicked upward, unsure at first, then returned to the dog. "Because he doesn't leave," they said softly. "Even when it's scary, he stays." Hey. Words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward. For the jurors, the meaning was obvious. Safety wasn't abstract. It was presence. For the judge, it was a reminder that the law, too, should never leave the vulnerable behind. James Clark, for once, did not object, did not interject with questions of relevance. He sat quietly, his usual sharpness dulled by something he couldn't quite name. Compassion, he realized, was not weakness. It was strength, a kind of strength that held up a trembling child in a courtroom too large for them. Minutes passed, but it felt as though time itself had slowed. The usual rhythm of testimony and questioning had dissolved. What remained was something more intimate, a lesson unfolding in real time, spoken not through polished arguments, but through the soft trust between a child and a dog. And as everyone in the room bore witness to it, they found themselves changed. The jurors would leave that day carrying more than notes and impressions. They would carry the memory of compassion rising unbidden in their hearts. Rachel Miller would leave reminded that her job was not merely to win cases, but to fight for those too small to fight for themselves. James Clark would leave haunted, questioning for the first time whether the pursuit of victory could ever outweigh the pursuit of truth. And Judge Warren would leave knowing that compassion was not a detour from justice. It was the very path to it. The lesson was not in statutes or precedents. It was in the small fingers clutching a teddy bear. It was in the steady presence of a dog who asked for nothing but to stay. It was in the way strangers came together, united by a single fragile voice. That day, compassion was no longer an abstract virtue. It was a living, breathing force, teaching everyone in that courtroom that sometimes the smallest people carried the greatest truths. And though trials were meant to decide guilt or innocence, facts or lies, this one had already revealed something deeper. Justice without compassion was empty. The child looked up once more, eyes wide, and whispered to the K9, "You make me brave." And with those words, the lesson was complete. The proceedings continued, but the rhythm of the courtroom had shifted irreversibly. The child had spoken, and with each word whispered to the K9, an invisible thread of change had woven itself into the fabric of the room. The attorneys continued. With their careful questioning, the jurors took notes, and the judge presided with her usual authority, but underneath it all, something had transformed. No one could quite define it, yet everyone felt it. The fragile power of trust, courage, and compassion had altered the usual calculus of the courtroom. The child, a mere 3 years old, had become a teacher of humanity in a place designed for facts and evidence. Rachel Miller, the prosecutor, noticed it first. Her carefully rehearsed line of questioning suddenly seemed less important than ensuring the child felt supported, that the tiny witness was heard in their own way. She allowed pauses softened. Her tone, and occasionally nodded at the child and the K9, signaling approval. It wasn't procedural, it was human. Even James Clark, the defense attorney, was forced to adjust. His meticulous notes, meant to catch inconsistencies, became secondary to the recognition of courage he had never considered during trials. He found himself leaning back in his chair more than once, letting the child's small declarations of bravery sink in. He scribbled notes not for cross-examination, but to remember how profoundly human the courtroom could become. The jurors, too, were changed. Faces once neutral with civic responsibility now displayed genuine empathy. They had arrived to weigh evidence and deliver a verdict, yet here they were, swept into something far greater, a real lesson in compassion. Some exchanged quiet glances, as if to say, "We have to remember this beyond the case." The K9, oblivious to the legal proceedings around him, remained the silent center of this transformation. Each subtle movement, a nudge of his nose toward the child, a low huff, the gentle shift of his paws, carried messages of reassurance. In his presence, the toddler's confidence grew, and in turn, everyone in the courtroom felt a quiet strengthening of their own hearts. When the child again whispered to the dog, "You stay with me," it became clear that this bond extended beyond mere comfort. It was a demonstration of loyalty, consistency, and the tangible impact of love. The courtroom, which often relied on abstract concepts like justice and truth, was seeing these principles made concrete through this relationship. By the time the testimony was complete, the story had already begun to leave its mark. Reporters who had been trained to focus on legal facts found themselves scribbling lines about courage, trust, and unexpected friendships. One photographer quietly took a picture of the toddler resting against the dog, capturing not just an image, but a symbol of hope. This photo would later appear in newspapers, online news sites, and community newsletters, spreading the story far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Even the courthouse staff, who had witnessed countless hearings, were touched. A bailiff muttered to a colleague, "I've never seen anything like this." The clerk who recorded the proceedings looked up from her notes, staring at the child with a softness she rarely allowed herself in public. They were witnesses not just to a trial, but to an extraordinary lesson in human empathy. Outside the courtroom, the impact began to ripple further. Local families learned about the story through news coverage. Community centers and schools discussed it in newsletters and assemblies. Social media shared images and quotes from the child's brave moments. People from all walks of life, parents, Teachers, even law enforcement officers, talked about the power of a simple act of compassion and how a small voice could resonate far beyond its immediate surroundings. The sheriff's office, which had provided the K-9, recognized the effect as well. They began discussing programs to incorporate therapy and support animals more broadly, not just in courtrooms, but in schools, hospitals, and community centers. What had started as a single request to help one child testify safely became the blueprint for a larger initiative, one designed to give vulnerable children the same opportunity for comfort and courage. Judge Warren, reflecting later that evening, realized that her decision to allow the K-9 into the courtroom had done more than support a witness. It had created a precedent, a quiet revolution in the way the justice system could acknowledge the humanity of those it served. Justice, she understood more clearly than ever, wasn't only about laws and punishments. It was also about protection, understanding, and empathy. Even the child's parents, sitting in the gallery, were struck by the widespread effects of what seemed like a small moment. They had only wanted their child to feel safe during a terrifying experience, yet that safety had multiplied, inspiring empathy in dozens of adults, and ultimately, perhaps, in hundreds of others who would hear the story later. As the trial continued to its conclusion, the ripple effect of that day became increasingly clear. Jurors would deliberate with a renewed sense of responsibility. Attorneys would reflect on the importance of emotional support, and the judge would carry the memory of that moment with her for the rest of her career. It was a quiet, powerful demonstration that even the smallest voice could echo far beyond the walls in which it was spoken. By the time the courthouse emptied, the story was already traveling outward. Conversations spilled into local cafes, church gatherings, and neighborhood meetings. The image of the toddler leaning against the K-9, eyes full of trust and vulnerability, became emblematic of courage in the face of fear. Community leaders cited it as a reminder that empathy should never be undervalued, even in spaces governed by rules and authority. Weeks later, programs inspired by the case began to emerge. Local schools invited K-9 officers for demonstrations not in enforcement, but in support of emotional learning. Children who were afraid to speak in front of their peers were paired with therapy animals to give them confidence. Judges in neighboring counties asked about the protocols used, seeking to replicate the success. And through it all, the memory of that toddler and their brave words remained at the center, proof that a single act of trust could catalyze change. Even for those who were not directly involved in the case, the story became a touchstone. Parents shared it with friends, therapists mentioned it during sessions, and local leaders referenced it in speeches about community resilience. The ripple effect grew, fueled by something simple yet profound, the undeniable power of compassion and trust. And for the child, unaware of the broader consequences, the impact was simple and personal. They had found courage, had felt safe, and had spoken their truth. The K-9 remained at their side, quiet, steady, a living reminder that bravery could take many forms, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in small touches, sometimes in the presence of a friend who would never leave. The courthouse, once just a place of law, had become a classroom for humanity. Those who had been present carried its lessons with them, some consciously, some subconsciously. They had learned that compassion could be taught through action, that courage could manifest in the smallest among us, and that trust could ripple outward in ways no one could fully anticipate. And in the quiet moments after the trial, when the gavel no longer marked proceedings, and the echoes of hurried footsteps faded from the marble floors, everyone carried the same unspoken acknowledgement. Justice is more than statutes and evidence. True justice listens, protects, and allows the vulnerable to be seen and heard. In the end, the impact of that day extended far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The memory of a tiny voice speaking to a loyal dog became a beacon for what justice could and should be: human, compassionate, and profoundly enduring. The courtroom was empty now, but the echoes of that morning lingered like a melody that refused to fade. The polished marble floors, once silent except for the shuffling of papers and footsteps, seemed to hum with the memory of a tiny voice that had spoken more truth than most adults ever dared. Judge Emily Warren remained seated for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the gavel, staring at the spot where the child and the K-9 had sat just hours before. Even in her solitude, she could feel the weight of what had transpired. It was not just a trial that had taken place. It was a testament to courage, compassion, and the transformative power of trust. In her 20 years on the bench, she had presided over countless hearings, but she knew instinctively that this one would remain etched in her memory forever. The child's words resonated with her still. "You stay with me." Simple, unpolished, yet imbued with a gravity that only genuine fear and trust could create. Those words had not been rehearsed or coaxed into existence by lawyers or judges. They had emerged naturally, powered by the bond between a frightened child and a faithful K-9 who refused to leave their side. Judge Warren reflected on the ripple effect of that day. Outside the courthouse, in the local newspaper, the story had already begun to circulate. Families and neighbors were talking about it. Teachers and counselors were sharing it as an example of bravery and emotional honesty. The case, she realized, had transcended the legal system and entered the realm of humanity. It had become something far larger than herself, the attorneys, or even the child. Rachel Miller, the prosecutor, would later recall that day as one of the most meaningful of her career. For her, the trial had begun as a legal obligation, a duty to protect a witness and pursue justice through traditional means. But by the time the child's testimony concluded, she realized that justice was far more than evidence and procedure. It was also about human connection, about creating an environment where the most vulnerable could be heard and supported. Even James Clark, who had spent the entire morning in his usual state of skepticism, could not deny the profound effect. He remembered the hesitant tilt of the child's head, the way their fingers had gently traced the K-9's fur, and the whisper of trust that had carried across the courtroom. He understood finally that law and compassion were not enemies. They were partners, each enhancing the other when applied thoughtfully. The child's parents, though exhausted, carried a different kind of memory. They had witnessed their little one confront fear in the most daunting environment imaginable. The memory of their child resting against the steadfast K-9, whispering words of trust and courage, was etched deep in their hearts. It was a quiet triumph, one that would shape their family for years to come, a reminder that even the smallest among them could hold immense bravery. The K-9 officer, too, would remain a silent hero in the story's memory. Though trained to respond to commands, his true contribution had been something far more profound. His presence, his patience, and his unwavering calm had given a frightened child the courage to speak. He had demonstrated that heroism is sometimes quiet, sometimes unseen, yet immeasurably powerful. Weeks later, Judge Warren found herself reflecting on the case long after the court had returned to its normal rhythm. She thought of the jurors who had carried the lesson home to their families and communities. She thought of the attorneys, the reporters, and the courthouse staff, all of whom had been subtly transformed by the simple act of a child speaking to a dog. Even the courthouse itself seemed to have absorbed a new energy, as if the walls had retained a whisper of the bravery that had unfolded within them. One quiet evening, Judge Warren returned to her chambers to review some files. Her eyes drifted to the gavel resting on her desk, the familiar symbol of authority and control. But on that day, it seemed to her less a tool of power and more reminder of responsibility, the responsibility to honor the voices that needed protection the most. and she thought of the tiny voice that had defied fear in her courtroom, a voice that would resonate far beyond the trial's end. In the weeks that followed, the story spread beyond local headlines. Community programs began to incorporate K9, officers for emotional support. Schools invited dogs into classrooms to help children express themselves. Families who had never considered the emotional needs of witnesses became advocates for a more compassionate approach. The ripple effect of a single morning in a courthouse became a movement, small but significant, rooted in the undeniable truth that trust and presence could change lives. The child, of course, had no idea of the legacy they were creating. For them, the K9 remained the anchor of courage, the source of comfort, and the companion who made the terrifying environment of a courtroom feel like a place they could survive. Their parents saw it clearly, and they were grateful beyond words, but the child simply accepted it as normal. The K9 stayed, and that was all that mattered. Judge Warren often thought back to that moment when she felt tears threaten to fall. On the bench, she remembered the quiet bravery of the toddler, the unspoken communication with the dog, and the way the courtroom had collectively held its breath. It had been a lesson in humility, in the power of listening, and in the realization that courage sometimes comes in the smallest forms. Years later, when she recounted the story to colleagues, she spoke not of legal precedents or case law, but of the profound human lesson she had witnessed. It was a courtroom transformed, she would say, not by arguments or evidence, but by a child's trust and a dog's loyalty. It reminded us all what it truly means to protect the vulnerable. Even for those outside the legal system, the memory endured. Reporters shared it, teachers discussed it, and families recalled it whenever they faced moments of fear or uncertainty. It became a story not about a trial, but about life itself, about the enduring power of courage, compassion, and the bonds that connect us in ways words cannot always capture. And in the quiet spaces of memory, the image remained vivid. The child perched in the oversized chair, eyes wide and shining, head resting against the K9, whispering words that had changed a room, touched hearts, and rippled far beyond the walls of the courthouse. It was a memory that lingered, and it would linger forever, a testament to bravery, to empathy, and to the enduring truth that even the smallest voice can leave a mark upon the world. The gavel sat silently on the desk. The courthouse returned to its routine, but in the hearts of everyone who had been present, the lessons of that day remained indelible, echoing in whispers of courage, trust, and compassion that would never be forgotten.